Rockaways Productions presents The Casey Waters Show, episode 478, Pricing the Priceless by Paula Diperna, Part 3. Hello, I'm your host, Casey Waters. Today, I will continue with Pricing the Priceless by Paula Diperna. Here, the author looks at putting a price on intangible assets such as the air we breathe and factoring these environmental intangibles of sorts into economic decision making, and thus hopefully we'll be able to fight climate change. Today's show will feature background footage from Deep Gap Trail. Deep Gap Trail is located at Mount Mitchell, North Carolina. To get there, take the Parkway heading north from Asheville, North Carolina, and take a left into Mount Mitchell State Park. Follow the road till you reach the parking lot at the summit. Right as the parking area begins, find a place to park. The trail goes down off to the left, not going to the summit, but rather goes down and then up to Mount Craig, and then down and up to Big Tom. Also, today's show will feature background footage from Providence, Massachusetts. Hold it, I meant to say Provincetown, Massachusetts, on Cape Cod. Recently, my partner and I went to Provincetown. Here, I have footage from Race Point Beach and Herring Cove Beach, as well as from downtown. So now, let's continue with Pricing the Priceless by Paula Diperna. We must face the fact that the city cannot and is not paying its debt as they become due and is insolvent. Among debilitating Detroit realities, the governor recited an unemployment rate double the national average, up 200% since 2000. Population decline of 60% since 1950. Income tax revenue decline of 40% since 2000. A wait on average of 58 minutes for the police to respond to a call, compared to a national average of 11 minutes. Police, fire trucks, and ambulances so old that breakdowns make it impossible to keep the fleet or properly carry out the roles. 40% of street lights not functioning in the first quarter of 2013. Plus that Mount Everest of borrowing debt and pending obligations. Now, let's go to page 60 of Pricing the Priceless by Paula Diperna. Feeling threatened, the ruling junta relaxed their hold on power a bit, paving the way for gradual normalization with the outside world. Eventually, this included the junta's release of long-standing political dissident and global human rights icon Aung San Suu Kyi, who had been under house arrest since 1989. made to forsake visiting her dying husband and children in the UK in order to maintain her Burmese passport and citizenship, and so beloved by her people they called her the Lady. Her return to public life and her nation's political leadership stage directly resulted from the government's inability to deal with a sweep of ocean waves, largely due to mangrove deforestation. So now, let's go to page 62, near the bottom of the page. Unfortunately, in 2021, Myanmar turned upside down again as democracy grew, led by Aung San Suu Kyi and her political party. The military clamped down, unsettled by the freedoms people expected. Then, astonishing the world, the lady herself seemed to switch coats, siding with repressive civic measures and unwilling to condemn the military slaughter of the Rohingya Muslim minority, only to have the tables turned once again. As of the end of 2022, Aung San Suu Kyi had been arrested, sentenced to 33 years in prison on questionable corruption charges, likely intended to keep her incarcerated and out of circulation for the rest of her life. Now, let's go to page 64 of Pricing the Priceless by Paula Diperna. To insert ecosystem service dynamics directly into the bedrock valuation of public equities, the Intrinsic Exchange Group, IEG, based in New York, hoped to launch what it calls natural asset companies, NACs, aimed at stewarding natural capital in partnership with the New York Stock Exchange, NYSE. In this potentially catalytic advance, NACs would be built on classical corporate startup structures, but diverge radically in terms of what constitutes startup value. The initial investable corpus of an NAC would derive from ecosystem services the NAC sought to protect and a credible business plan. NACs would synthesize, at last, the elusive, multiple, intangible values attributed to ecosystem services into a single and instantly recognizable metric, stock price. By gathering immeasurables into this, an unequivocally familiar measurement, NACs could take the subjectivity out of ecosystem service math, expressing nature's value in objective terms so that nature can be constructively, productively, and equitably priced. Standardizing the value of natural capital in this manner could also reassure investors who, after all, need to justify their choices quantitatively, and so might feed streams of new capital to nature's protection. Once successfully formed and listed, an NAC would be managed as any standard company, with an executive and governance structure consistent with established operating and oversight procedures for companies. conceived by Douglas Egger, an entrepreneur with longtime environmental leanings, by 24 through 25. By 2024 through 2025, equities in NACs could be listed and traded on the NYSE as any other stock. NACs at first would focus on large parcels of land owned by governments or individuals that had significant conservation potential or need. Investors would not own the land itself, but rather invest in the rights to the ecosystem services the land generates. The initial public offering, IPO, would raise the NAC's initial capital, and offering proceeds would generate revenue to maintain the ecosystem services of the land, i.e., maintain the land itself. So the value of protecting the parcel favorably competes with its value heavily developed or exploited. For example, an NAC could be created to support preservation of large tracts of forest or wetlands that would otherwise be vulnerable to extractive development or sale for commercial purposes. An NAC would earn revenue as it monetized ecosystem services through various existing pricing mechanisms, such as carbon markets, or from revenue earned by environmentally conscientious business activities that NAC might undertake. For example, an NAC might engage in selective forestry or agricultural production that did not draw down the value of the ecosystem services being provided. In short, no sapping or devaluing what the Dasgupta review calls the intrinsic worth of nature, the worth the intrinsic exchange seeks to enshrine. Underlying NAC capital value would depend on the performance of the ecosystem services intrinsic to a given NAC, assessed scientifically. Ongoing NAC performance would be reported to shareholders and capital markets through annual reports, regular investor engagement, and the usual data providers covering the outlook of companies listed on the NYSE and potentially beyond. Now, let's go to page 71 of Pricing the Priceless by Paula Diperna. The trapped heat must make itself room in the tight space of the atmosphere, so it shoves wind, water vapor, and clouds around the earth like bags of rags, wreaking havoc with established weather patterns, triggering wild storms, drought, extreme weather swings, and other frightful, unpredictable breakdowns of the seasons. The worst of climate change remains unknown, but meanwhile, the first of climate change impact are already underway worldwide, raising the odds that catastrophic events will occur more frequently. Carbon dioxide buildup in the atmosphere and its relationship to water vapor and climate variations was deemed suspicious as early as 1896 by Swedish chemist Svante Arrhenius. His inquiries were inconclusive, but they indicate just how long climate science and climate change concern have been ahead of public policy and financial practice, especially as we project objectives of vanquishing the dangers of greenhouse gas emissions by the far-off date of 2050. Decades have been spent in climate change study and worry, and with clear warnings put before our eyes. In 1958, environmental chemist and oceanographer Dr. Charles Keeling suspected accumulating CO2 in the atmosphere. To check his hunch, he installed the world's first system to track CO2 concentrations globally at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, operated by the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. The system showed CO2 only going up, plotted irrefutably in what became known as a Keeling curve. In a paper published in 1970 by the American Philosophical Society, Keeling warned that escalating CO2 levels could one day disrupt Earth's climate, even if science was still, comparatively speaking, not dead sure. Now, let's go to page 76. Discouragingly, it took a virus to accomplish what no national or global climate policy and activism yet had. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic and its lockdowns achieved the greatest drop in CO2 on record, according to United in Science, a consortium of international organizations, including the IPCC, United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, and the World Meteorological Organizations, WMO. This drop may have confirmed the worst fears of heel draggers that holding down emissions is incompatible with economic activity and economic growth. Since COVID restrictions have loosened, reported United in Science, CO2 emissions have exceeded pre-pandemic levels recorded in early 2019. Now, let's go to page 77 of Pricing the Priceless by Paula Diperna. Author Jonathan Franzen candidly and succinctly framed the scope of climate change in a pre-COP21 New Yorker article in 2015. The problem here is that it makes no difference to the climate whether any individual, me included, drives to work or rides a bike. The scale of greenhouse gas emissions is so vast, the mechanisms by which those emissions affect the climate so nonlinear, and the effects so widely dispersed in time and space that no specific instance of harm could ever be traced back to my 0.0000001% contribution to emissions. France's dismissal of grassroots activism seemed heretic to many environmental observers, but he was right. especially about the nonlinear nature of the problem. No amount of individual action, well intentioned but fragmented, impersonalized, can effectively consolidate to reroute economic activity at the scale required to excise fossil fuel prevalence. The individual's moral impulse is best channeled and scaled up through national systems and regulatory institutions to both force and entice large entities that pollute most to pay, reduce emissions, and continue reducing. Carbon markets, designed well, can provide the necessary rigor, scope, incentives, and flexibility. Now, let's go to page 91 of Pricing the Priceless by Paula Diperna. Not to say that cap and trade is the perfect system. It tantalizes with potential, but its basic operating premise that some emitters can over-emit while others do not riles and irks critics who argue that the buy option lets emitters off the hook, enabling them to spend their way out of taking direct action. Yes, of course, some polluters work harder than others to cut and avoid emissions, but if the cap is tight enough and the rigor serious, no emitter can escape the system or buy a way out forever. Also, by pricing carbon, cap and trade encourages the least costly emissions reductions to occur first, as sellers demonstrate the benefits of best practice, speeding its uptake, gradually herding in the rest of the emitters under the cap. As caps are tightened, laggers have nowhere to hide, as it were. Sooner or later, the cost of making actual reductions becomes financially irresistible compared to buying allowances. Cap and trade does allow emitters to buy time, but not indefinitely. Since emitters, by definition, have diverse emissions scope and profile, cap and trade offers refuge from a one-size-fits-all approach, but with teeth, considering that our suffering atmosphere is blind to which emitter spends more, which reduction technology is used, or who is driven by ethical zeal or profit motive. All that matters in a cap and trade is that emissions growth stops and begins to fall. Now, let's go to page 103, Pricing the Priceless by Paula Diperna. The prize was the gold, an original adventure, the chance to negotiate a landmark deal that would set up China's first pilot carbon market and cap and trade system, bringing carbon pricing to China and catapulting carbon pricing worldwide. By 2007, founder and CEO of Chicago Climate Exchange, CCX, Richard Sandor, and I, then Executive Vice President for Recruitment at CCX, had attended various drawn-out discussions about next steps in carbon pricing since CCX opened in 2003. We felt success in China could speed progress and maybe save the world a decade on gripping the climate change problem. Ever thinking ahead, Sandor envisioned CCX in China as the vital stepping stone to a global cap in trade. China's national greenhouse gas emissions were roughly 5 billion tons and poised to surpass U.S. emissions. In the United States, carbon markets were still politically alive, and the EU ETS perked along. If China entered the family, we believed its sheer size would significantly advance the crafting of a tight global carbon budget and trading of emissions credits as seamlessly as currencies, with emissions reductions occurring nation by nation each year. Now let's go to page 115 and continuing on to page 116 of Pricing the Priceless by Paula Diperna. The China cap and trade can also seem like a bit of a sweetened pot in that it does not require emissions reductions in absolute terms, i.e., reductions of physical tons purely, but instead reductions measured in reduced carbon intensity, i.e., reduction in physical tons emitted per economic unit of output. This means a first emphasis on fossil fuel efficiency rather than fossil fuel elimination outright. For example, we could take one refrigerator as an economic unit and suppose that half an absolute ton of carbon dioxide is emitted from start to finish to manufacture that fridge, including mining of ore for steel, transport, production of steel, and fabrication of the refrigerator. If the manufacturer reduces emissions, Casey Waters Show. Producer, Casey Waters. Graphic editing, Judson Laird. Please note our new email address, CaseyWaters2 at CaseyWaters.com.